began with an old porcelain doll gifted to her by her grandmother. The doll was beautiful but unsettling, its glass eyes painted with exquisite detail, its lips forming a faint smile that seemed to change in the dark. "This doll has been in the family for generations," her grandmother whispered, "and it will keep you safe." But soon she noticed strange things. She'd catch the doll out of the corner of her eye, its expression seeming to shift. And then came the whispers. At first, faint and nearly imperceptible, they grew louder each night. After several nights of disturbing silence, she began to notice faint noises, just on the edge of hearing. Soft whispers, barely audible, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. At first, she dismissed it, thinking it was just her mind playing tricks in the quiet darkness. But as the nights wore on, the whispers grew, like faint murmurs drifting from the doll's direction. She tried to ignore it. She covered the doll with a cloth and placed it on a high shelf, hoping that out of sight meant out of mind. But the whispers continued, becoming clearer each night, like a voice calling to her from far away. It wasn't just any voice. It was her own. One particular night, the whispers became louder, pressing against the silence of the room, filling the shadows with an eerie presence. Driven by both fear and a strange compulsion, she walked over to the doll and listened closely, her heart pounding as she leaned in, pressing her ear against its cold porcelain cheek. At first, there was only silence. Then, slowly, a voice emerged, soft and faint, as if it were trapped in a distant echo. "Help me," the voice whispered. "I'm so cold." The voice, to her horror, was identical to her own. She staggered back, almost dropping the doll. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the sound. Was it a trick of her mind, or was there truly something alive within this doll? Over the following days, she tried everything to silence the voice. She locked the doll away in a box and buried it under piles of clothes in her closet. But each night, like clockwork, she heard it again. Faint, muffled by layers of fabric, yet still unmistakable. The words grew more frantic, more pleading. The whisper now began as a soft chant, repeating her name over and over. She would lie awake, paralyzed with fear, her eyes wide open in the dark, listening to the endless murmur of her own name. Every time she tried to fall asleep, it felt as if the voice grew louder, as though it could sense her fear and desperation. One evening, she decided she had to investigate. She gathered the courage to take the doll back out and examine it closely under a dim lamp. Its face looked so innocent, yet its eyes seemed to glisten with a knowing look, almost as if it were waiting for her. Her fingers trembled as she ran them over its delicate features, trying to find any hidden mechanism that could explain the whispers. But there was nothing unusual, just the cold, smooth porcelain. As she gazed into the doll's eyes, she began to feel as if she were falling into them, like they were pulling her into a void. She felt a strange dizziness, her vision blurring as shadows seemed to swirl around her. Hours seemed to pass in that trance, and yet she couldn't look away. Her own reflection within the doll's glassy eyes seemed to twist and morph, and for a split second, she thought she saw herself trapped behind those eyes, banging against the glass, pleading to be let out. In a panic, she broke free of the gaze, clutching the doll tightly. She was gasping for breath, her body drenched in a cold sweat. Could it be that her very essence, her soul, was being drawn into the doll? As days turned into weeks, the whispers became part of her nightly routine. Each evening, she would lie in bed, the sound of her own voice echoing in her mind, filling the quiet with an unending plea for help. She started to question her own sanity, wondering if the doll was alive, or if she was simply losing her grip on reality. Her friends noticed her growing exhaustion, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she flinched at the slightest sound. She tried to explain the situation, but every time, her words seemed hollow, unbelievable, even to herself. Who would believe that a doll could whisper, let alone steal a piece of her very being? One night, as she lay on the edge of sleep, the whisper changed. It no longer pleaded for help, but instead, it laughed. A soft, mocking laugh that sent chills down her spine. The laugh was her own, but twisted, distorted, as though something inside the doll was mimicking her voice, mocking her terror. In a fit of desperation, she finally decided to destroy it. She took the doll to the backyard, wielding a hammer, her hands shaking. But as she raised the hammer, the doll's eyes seemed to flicker with a life of their own, and the voice grew louder, filling her mind with screams. She found herself paralyzed, unable to bring down the hammer. It was as if an unseen force held her back, the doll's gaze pinning her in place. Her own reflection in its eyes seemed to scream in silent terror, trapped, pleading, but beyond her reach. Overwhelmed with fear, she let the doll fall to the ground. She watched as it lay there, untouched, its porcelain face cracked, but otherwise unharmed. The voice had stopped, but she knew it was only a matter of time before it started again, more insistent, more demanding, waiting for her to listen once more. In a final attempt to end the haunting, she tried to confront the presence. She stood at her door, calling out, demanding it leave her alone. The footsteps stopped. Silence filled the air. But then, a whisper from the other side. "Let me in." Since that night, she never heard the footsteps again. But every so often, she'd feel a chill, a breath on her neck, and a presence lingering in her empty hallway, waiting for her to open the door.